Butler's a really interesting character in the sense that the way that she has put forward she's taken it from obviously other major theorists in her background, in her educational background, but she's come to a way of looking at gender and certainly looking at the way sexuality is constituted in our lives. And what I find particularly interesting about her work is around performativity. And I think performativity and how she uses that in the context of gender is really interesting. Now, when I work with my students in terms of understanding performativity, the first thing they think of is, well, okay, a performance. Somebody on a stage, that somebody makes up something. And, you know, in some sense, performativity is a bit like that. But the problem is that, in terms of performance, getting on a stage, we become consciously that actor, and we consciously take on a role. We consciously look a certain way, and we consciously learn our notes, and we consciously perform that particular character. Performativity is very different in the sense that we get up every day and we do the performance, but we don't know we're actually doing it. And we're unconscious of that. It's actually so strong, the way that we do it, that it becomes part of our everyday way of being. So in other words, what we're doing very unconsciously is that we're actually taking on a particular way of doing who we are as a gendered being, and we don't know we're really doing that. We're very unconscious of doing that. We're unconscious of getting up every morning, putting on particular clothing, speaking, acting the way we are, doing our hair in a certain way, all those sorts of characteristics that we actually understand to be a particular type of gender. So what's so powerful about it is that we do that every day without even thinking about it. And it's the repetitive process that we're actually doing that. How we do that every day without thinking becomes the way that we actually speak that into existence. We actually speak the discourse of gender into existence in that way. And it is seen to be so natural that it's not even questioned. And I think that what she has done is said, well, hang on a sec, this is a process here, that gender is a process. It's a socially constructed process. And how do we intervene in that is by first being conscious. That is very much a part of the way that we construct it every day without thinking about it, through the way that we do gender on a very daily basis and without even thinking about it. So what's also critical about it is that a performance, even a performance on the stage, is a performance for somebody else. And the thing about performativity and the thing about gender is that we are actually unconsciously doing a performance for someone else, and it's primarily the other people who make judgments about whether we're doing our gender correctly or not. We're so concerned about doing it properly that we hone our performance so dramatically to keep within that very, very rigid boundaries of what have been constituted as the appropriate gender for girls, for femininity, the appropriate context of masculinity, without realising that it's the power of it is something that we just give over to in that respect. So it's seen as something that we inherently do. That it's natural. Like if you don't think about it, then it must be a really natural process that's coming from somewhere. Like I'm not doing it, it's coming from inside me. That somehow or other, that's where it takes on. It's very, very strong perspective that it's a natural part of a biological way of being in the world. And what's really interesting about it is that performance, when you actually sit back and start realising, well, okay, you can look at the mirror and say, well, okay, this is, I'm looking really great today. But the performance becomes when you walk out your door for other people.
Posthumanist theory challenges a number of assumptions, and I'd like to just briefly outline a few of the most important challenges and features of this particular way of thinking. First off, it challenges the assumption that humans live in the world as autonomous individuals. So posthumanist theorists such as Donna Haraway stress the ways in which our experience of living in the world is not singly a human one, that it's one in which we're enmeshed with other human beings as well as other species with which we share the world. In her most recent book, When Species Meet, she's focusing upon the relations between humans and companion species, but particularly dogs as companion species. And she talks about the ways in which our evolutionary histories, both biological and cultural, are completely entwined. So this, in a way, really disputes the assumption that we have through humanism and through the kind of liberalist philosophies that flow from humanism, that each of us is an autonomous individual acting sort of singularly upon the world and making our own decisions independently of others. Very much the challenge of posthumanist thinking is a challenge to this notion of autonomy and the notion of the radical individual separate from everything else. Not only every other human being, but every other more than human entity as well. The second important challenge from posthumanist perspectives is a challenge to an assumption of human exceptionalism that's based on the notion that humans alone exercise agency in this world. So, for instance, the work of Bruno Latour is important here. He talks about this notion of assemblage as a notion in which humans are connected in a network of associations with the more than human. He talks about the ways in which it's the assemblages rather than individual humans that exercise agency to change the world. For instance, some of the earliest revolutionary changes in terms of agriculture came from assemblages of humans, animals, and machines. For instance, the horse-pulled plough, the horse-driven plough is a great example of that. Within posthumanist theory, agency is really reconceptualised. So it's reconceptualised beyond the human and the individual human, making conscious decisions to act on the world, and it's repositioned as a part of a relationship between the human and the more than human, or between a collective of humans. So agency is always understood as a collective process, an engaged process. And Latour's examples of assemblages in which you can't really take the humans away from the rest of the assemblage and just consider their actions alone. For instance, with the horse and the plough, the horse-driven plough, you can't take the horse out of the effects upon the soil, the cultivation process, the agency of cultivating the soil in order to grow plants isn't a process that takes place through human action alone. It's actually a joint effort between the human and the horse and the plough itself and the soil that's being tilled and the seeds that are being planted. So it's much more of a holistic notion, a collective notion of agency. Sometimes people get a little confused about the notion of more than human agency, because part of the notion of agency within the humanist tradition is that agency has to be deliberate, has to be a conscious act. So we have to have some sort of understanding that we are acting in order to be an agent. There has to be a self-consciousness to this. There has to be an intention to this. But in Latour's notion of agency and in the broader posthumanist notion of agency, the non-human actants have agency, not without intention, but within that imbroglio of association and relationship. So it's the whole outfit working together as a kind of a unit, that whole assemblage working as a unit that makes the things happen, that makes the changes. The humans don't do it alone. That's the point. The third major point, I suppose, is that with all this emphasis upon interdependence and interdeterminacy, that posthumanist theory is really blurring the boundaries between the human and the more than human worlds, looking at the ways in which you can't really understand or think about one without recognising the ways that humans are enmeshed with the whole lot, the whole collective of entities, human, non-human, living and inert, with which we share the world. So this sense of collective is an important concept in posthumanist theory, and it in itself really challenges that notion of the autonomous individual.
In particular, I've been thinking about how queer theory can help teachers look beyond normative practices in early childhood education and care. Well, I like to think about what we take for granted and how what we take for granted can obscure some people, some knowledge, some understandings. And so I can use queer theory to help make a space in teachers' practices to think about new ways of understanding the world, new ways of recognising people, families, children, colleagues. And so queer theory provides quite a useful way for thinking beyond the norm or normative ways of knowing. I first came across queer theory through reading the writings of people like Deborah Britzman. She wrote about queering curriculum in education. Anne-Marie Jagosi, who wrote a very useful book on queer theory as a kind of introductory reader. Judith Butler writes around queer theory, and Michael Warner writes around queer theory. Queer theory for me allows me to ask how is what we do with children and families sexualised, and really how is it heterosexualised? And so we can look at our curriculum and our practices and our policies and think, what kind of sexualities, what kind of genders, what kind of family forms are being privileged or being used as a standard against which other families' sexualities and genders might be being compared. And so one of the things queer theory does for me is help me think about how is our practice heterosexualised? That's a very useful question to ask as a teacher, because it's not one we would readily go to. I think another way that queer theory helps my work is because it asks you to think in a non-normative way, to really unpack the taken for grantedness in our work, that it can help me interrupt any binary thinking when I see it become apparent in my practice, or in practices with students, or in students' practices with children and families. So where we set up binarisms, where there's a us and them, a this or that, mother or father, him or her, heterosexual or homosexual, where I see those kind of patternings happening in our practice, queer theory reminds me that there's always a lot of power invested in those binary orderings. And so I might ask a question that will try and interrupt that binary thinking. So it's very useful for thinking around and disrupting power in relationships and in social settings. And the third thing I wanted to talk about was that using queer theory reminds me constantly that sexualities is deeply relevant to the work we do with children, with families and with each other, because it's about identities, it's about our interpersonal relationships, it's about the ways that we love and relate with each other. And I think to ignore that human element of our work in education is to our detriment. And so queer theory allows me to put that on the table. Well, I can give you an example of a practice that wasn't particularly queer. Well, it was queer from the children's point of view, but it wasn't queer from the teacher's point of view. And I'm thinking about some work that a colleague told me about, where there are some children playing in the sandpit, and one of the children's parents, one of the children had lesbian parents, and they were playing lesbian families in the sandpit. And nearby a teacher was sitting, and a duck, a mallard, just flew in over the fence, as it would, because that's what mallards do sometimes. And the teacher nearby looked up from what she was doing and she just said, "Hello, Mrs. Duck." And that was a practice that was completely and utterly not queer. So the children's play was respectful and knowing about same-sex relationships and same-gender parents and family formations that were not the heteronorm. And right beside them was their teacher, who, as soon as the duck flew in over the fence, immediately reinscribed that normative family structure. And so I wasn't there, and my colleague wasn't there either, we have written about it subsequently, but I would have wanted to have talked to that teacher and queered her understanding, opened up the possibilities that she might understand her practice in a different way, to allow for those other identities and family formations to be visible and to pick up on what the children already knew in their curriculum.
Whiteness is in itself a socially constructed category. So in thinking about whiteness theory, we're really looking at the ways in which being white, in the words of Richard Dyer, is posited as the human norm. So, for example, if I was to turn on the television, I'm most likely to see someone of my own race being represented. If I'm at school learning about Australian history, I'm most likely to hear that someone from my own race contributed to the building of the nation we know today as Australia. So things like that, where whiteness is centralised and it's seen to be the norm. Whiteness theory then helps us to think about the ways that whiteness infiltrates social and political systems, and the ways that whiteness, gives legitimacy to particular views over others. So, for example, it validates dominant values as being central or in the centre, and it relegates non-white values or thinking to the margins. I think with whiteness, in terms of being an educator, whiteness theory can also help us to explore the ways in which very subtle forms of whiteness form part of everyday racism in early childhood contexts. Whiteness theories are interdisciplinary, and depending on how they're used, there can be a different focus and approach. Something that's common to all whiteness theories is the way that they work to denaturalise whiteness, or think critically about the ways that whiteness is constructed as being normal or central, or that it's natural. In learning about my own whiteness, I found it quite useful as a starting point to read Peggy McIntosh's article, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. And it really showed me the ways that I can use, often unknowingly, or abuse, if you like, whiteness in my everyday life. So I'm never asked to speak on behalf of my race, or if I do something well, I'm not called a credit to my race. I can be quite sure when I send my son to school every day that he's going to be learning about things that, give credit to his race of being white. So these are the kinds of things that Peggy McIntosh raises in her article, and it was a really good starting point for me to begin to understand that process of whiteness and the ways that whiteness feeds through everyday life and is used and abused by people. Whiteness theories have been critiqued, and for good reason, and I think as a white person there needs to be a level of awareness about the ways in which whiteness theory can be problematic. So to provide some examples, sometimes when white people undertake a journey, if you like, or exploration of their own racial positioning and developing awareness about that, they can shift to a position of seeing themselves as a good white person. So a good white person might be someone who has a high level of racial awareness. They're quite aware of historical circumstances and the ways that these circumstances have positioned people in particular ways and enabled people to have access to particular resources and so forth. So if you're a good white person, it means that you see yourself as being different from other white people, that you've reached a level of racial awareness more superior to other people of your own race. So this can really get people to a point where they stop learning or stop thinking more critically or more deeply about their own racial positioning. So that's just one caution in terms of using whiteness theory. I think in early childhood education, the uptake of whiteness theory has tended to focus somewhat on individual white bodies. So by that I mean there's been some very good and important work around the ways that pre-service teachers and also practicing educators go through a process of learning about their own racial positioning in a society, and then therefore the ways that that positioning impacts or influences their thinking and practices with young children. So I think there's been some really good and very solid work around that. I wonder if there needs to be a bit more work in terms of thinking about whiteness from an institutional perspective. So more as a collective, thinking about the ways that whiteness permeates or infiltrates early childhood education more broadly, in terms of the theoretical underpinnings of our work and policy and all that kind of thing. So I think there has been some really good work in terms of whiteness theory, but I wonder if there's been a bit too much on the individual white body. And sometimes, particularly in critiques of whiteness theory, there's been the key point that whiteness theory for white people can become quite indulgent because it's a matter of focusing on self. It sort of repositions or recenters whiteness because there's a focus on that from a white individual. So that's just one caution in terms of the application of whiteness theory in our everyday work. For white people, an understanding of whiteness and the way it infiltrates everyday life can be quite difficult because it's that idea that it's really quite invisible and can be quite difficult to see because no one ever asks you to stop and critique your way of life. So I've used examples where you can turn on the television and see people of your own race represented. If you open a storybook, there'll most likely be white characters there. So it's very normalised. There's never a moment where you're asked to justify your positioning based on your race, or you're never asked to speak on behalf of people of your race. So whiteness can be quite a tricky concept to grasp. It's like that fishbowl idea where you're in the water but you don't know you're in water because it's part of everyday life.
I'm interested in the philosophy of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari and what that means for our thinking and our understandings of young children and their learning. Now, one of the things that they do is give us ways for disrupting the binary, the very structured either-or way of thinking that's been very pervasive in our thinking since Descartes announced, "I think, therefore I am." So that a 21st century response to Descartes might be, we flow in our thinking alone and together all at once. And this is characterised as streams of becoming, as we are constantly becoming something different. Now, this way of thinking through Deleuze and Guattari allows us to think more generatively about young children. It takes them out of the boxes that developmental thinking has put them in. It moves them outside possibilities for being constantly in deficit, as being immature, incomplete, incompetent. So there are many ideas within Deleuzian thinking that can be useful to working with young children. And there are just three that I would like to mention today, and they're not necessarily key points as such. They're three that I particularly find useful, and they're three that interrelate together. Other scholars would probably choose other of their ideas and say that they're quite useful, but often all of them are really are quite interconnected. So the ones that I want to just touch on briefly are lines of flight, rhizome, and becoming. Now, lines of flight is about thinking in process. Thinking is always in movement, that it's more about how we move through learning spaces and through ideas rather than any particular ideas or facts or knowledge that we might come to. And this kind of makes sense when you look at the world and think how fast everything is changing. That if we work with our ways of thinking and encourage children to work with their ways of thinking, this is probably going to be more useful to them in 20 years' time than any particular facts that we, as adults now, have decided children need to know about. So lines of flight open all sorts of possibilities for thinking differently about how we think with young children and how we encourage them to think about what it is that they're doing and about their learning. For example, lines of flight often occur, I think, when suddenly we have an idea that popped in from absolutely nowhere. And it is so easy to disregard those ideas because it didn't take any effort to find it, it didn't take any effort to get there in that thinking space. It may be that we look at a painting, we look at a dance, we look at the landscape, and it reminds us of how children play in some sorts of ways. I think of flying across the land of Australia towards Adelaide one day and looking down at the patterns in the land, and there were very organised patterns of roads, and intermixed with all that were the undulations, the contours of the land where streams had flowed through. So it's thinking about how those sorts of ideas, for example, can affect how we look at young children and what we think about them. That, okay, we can put them into little boxes, and there are probably parts of developmentalism that we may not ever discard, and that there are some things that can be quite useful. But as well as that, there's a whole raft of other things going on for young children, the way they live their lives, the way they play out their understandings of their learning, that are useful to us, intermixed with that. So another of the thinking ideas that Deleuze and Guattari offer us is the idea of rhizome. Now, when we think about rhizome in terms of the biological rhizome, we're thinking of a plant that spreads multidimensionally. It shoots upwards, it roots downwards, it extends outwards, and it also intensifies inwards in that some rhizomes form tubers. Also, a lot of what happens with the biological rhizome happens underground. It's hidden, it's out of sight. Now, thinking with rhizome and thinking through rhizome, and I prefer to say it that way than using the term rhizomatic. So thinking with rhizome is a good way of moving outside arborescent thinking, or what Deleuze and Guattari call arborescent thinking, and that's the old traditional conventional tree of knowledge, whereby certain facts and ideas are built one upon another and they're constructed. One thing leads to another, and you can only learn one thing when you've learnt something else. So, but the idea of rhizome is that things emerge unexpectedly in unexpected places, and things merge in unexpected ways as well. And so the learning that is happening cannot be prescribed or specified. It just happens. If we stop thinking in that way, then we are removing the possibility of children being seen in deficit. And thinking about children in deficit, even though it's something that many of us say we don't do, we probably do actually do quite a lot of, because we assume that because children are younger and smaller, they're inexperienced, they don't know enough of the ways of the world, that they have to grow in stature and through the years to have the maturity to be able to act on a par with adults. Now, I would disagree with that. I think that children's experience, young children's experience, is just as valid as adult experience, and often out there in the world, children make the most amazing statements about how we should live peaceably in the world, for example, or what we should do with our rubbish, or what we should not do with our water supplies, and things like that. Another example of thinking about how learning emerges is sometimes when suddenly you are aware that a child can read. Now, I had this experience recently with a grandson of mine whose mother was reading a story to him, left him to do something with the baby, came back and he said, "It's all right, you don't need to read anymore, I've finished it." And she was totally amazed. She didn't believe that he had. She asked him some questions, and sure enough, he had read. Now, she'd been taking him through processes of learning words, sort of out of context, but not really. And he'd lost interest. He'd refused to do it. And then suddenly things all came together for him, and whatever it was that he'd been doing along the way showed, he realised that he could actually read it. And now, as a 7-year-old, he's reading way, way above his supposed developmental level. But I would sort of say that he's not reading above his level. He's reading at the level that is appropriate for him in his 7-year-old way of being in the world. Thinking with rhizome works alongside another of Deleuze and Guattari's imaginaries, and that is the idea of becoming. Now, they use the idea of becoming not as a future-oriented concept of something that we will become somebody else or somebody different, or for children to become somebody mature and competent. They use becoming in terms of the present, of something that is already always happening all at once. So that means that we're always in processes of becoming, that we as adults are always in processes of becoming adult, and children are always in processes of becoming child, and collectively we're in process of becoming adults and of becoming children. So it is not something way out there in the future. It's just that whatever we are doing now is constantly changing who we are. And so a new us is emerging as we are always becoming something different. So this again takes us, or helps us to think of children beyond that deficit model. Because in the here and now, they are always who we are. And we are always just becoming something different of that person that we already are. Now, I think this idea of becoming is really important to how we interpret the national curriculum framework, belonging, being and becoming. Because for me, using Deleuzian thinking, being and becoming are interconnected, they're interrelated, and that one does not happen without the other or even exist without the other. So a good way of thinking about the relationship of being and becoming for me is to write it all as one word. So I write becoming, but around the C-O-M in the middle I put brackets. So that signals that becoming is something that emerges out of our being, and it also signals that our being merges with our becoming. So I think we need to think about being as becoming as living experience, as something that's happening now all at once. Being and becoming is then an embodied experience, and that again helps us move outside the boxes of developmental thinking. So as we move out of thinking about developmental stages or states of being, we are thinking about ourselves as being dynamic and constantly changing, that we're always moving through different aspects of our becoming, of who we are and who in the now we want to be. So in becoming we merge as beings and becomings.